Every authoritarian government in history has survived protests, but not a single one has survived protests when its own soldiers stopped obeying orders. That is the line. That is the specific, irreversible, historically documented threshold that separates a regime that survives its crisis from a regime that becomes a footnote in the history of its own country. Not the size of the protests, not the intensity of the anger, not the geographic spread or the duration or the slogans being chanted or the buildings being stormed. Those things matter, but they are not the variable that determines the outcome. The variable that determines the outcome is always, in every case, without exception, across the entire modern historical record of authoritarian collapse, what the men with the weapons decide to do when the order to fire arrives. And in Iran, right now in the summer of 2026, those men are making a decision that the Islamic Republic has spent 46 years and hundreds of billions of dollars trying to ensure they would never make. They are refusing, not all of them, not everywhere simultaneously, not in the dramatic, visible, coordinated way that makes headlines and gets captured on video. In the quiet, individual, one-by-one way that is actually far more dangerous to the regime than any dramatic public defection would be. In the way that starts with a soldier who does not show up for a deployment he was ordered to attend. In the way that continues with a commander who receives an order to move his unit to a protest location and reports equipment failure that cannot be immediately verified. In the way that accumulates through dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of individual decisions, each made privately, each made by a man calculating whether the institution he has served is still the institution whose orders are worth obeying, and arriving with increasing frequency and in increasing numbers at the answer that it is not. This is what makes the protests in Iran different this time. Not the protests themselves, though they are different too, and we will get to exactly how in a moment. What makes everything different this time is what is happening on the other side of the line, in the barracks, in the command centers, in the specific, consequential, history-altering space between an order being given and an order being followed. That space has opened up in Iran, and once it opens, it does not close on its own. Let us start with the number that changes everything you thought you knew about Iran's security situation. The number is 340. That is the number of IRGC personnel assigned to one documented forward operating base in Iran in the summer of 2026. 340 soldiers. Assigned. On the official order of battle, drawing pay, or supposed to be drawing pay, from the IRGC's payroll system. Assigned to an active military installation during an ongoing conflict that the Islamic Republic's own parliament has acknowledged, in recorded session, has not been won and cannot be continued. When an operational readiness assessment was conducted at that base, the number of personnel actually present was 31. 31 out of 340. An 89% absence rate, not casualties. Not transfers, not personnel on authorized leave, absent, gone. Having made the individual, private, rational calculation that an organization that has not paid their salary for 4 consecutive months, that is asking them to suppress a population whose suffering they share, in service of an institutional narrative that their own parliament has publicly invalidated, is an organization whose claim on their physical presence at a military installation has expired. Think about that number for a moment. 31 out of 340. If you were a commander ordered to deploy that unit to suppress a protest in a provincial city, you would have 31 soldiers. To suppress a city. In a country where the conditions producing the protests, 180% food inflation, water rationing for 20 hours a day, 4 missed salary payments, a currency worth less than the paper it is printed on, are present in every city, in every neighborhood, in every household simultaneously. And that one documented base is not an anomaly. It is a data point in a pattern that has been verified across multiple units, multiple geographic areas, multiple branches of the IRGC structure by independent sources, including Iran International. Regional intelligence assessments shared through diplomatic channels and internal IRGC communications obtained through the diaspora networks that have become the primary intelligence pipeline for understanding what is actually happening inside Iranian military institutions. The pattern is consistent, the direction is consistent, and the direction is away from the institution, away from the orders, away from the regime, and toward the door. But desertion statistics, as devastating as they are for the regime's operational capacity, are only the most visible dimension of what is happening inside Iran's security forces right now. The more consequential development, the one that intelligence analysts are tracking as the single most significant indicator of where the current crisis is heading, is not the men who have already left. It is the men who are still present but are no longer fully compliant. The soldiers who show up but find reasons not to execute. The commanders who receive orders but discover operational complications that delay implementation. The officers who are present at their posts but whose behavior, in the critical moment of a direct confrontation with protesters, reveals something that their superiors cannot fully control and their subordinates cannot fully predict. This phenomenon has a name in military sociology. It is called passive noncompliance, and it is more dangerous to authoritarian regimes than active desertion for a specific reason. Active desertion is visible, it can be counted. It can be addressed through replacements or punishment or emergency payment arrangements. Passive noncompliance is invisible until the moment it matters. Until the moment the order to fire on civilians arrives and the soldier finds that his weapon is jammed, or that he was looking the other way, or that he misunderstood the command, or that he fired but somehow missed an entire crowd at point-blank range. It is the behavioral signature of an institution whose members have made a collective calculation that they will maintain the performance of loyalty until the cost of that performance exceeds the cost of abandoning it. And who are watching that calculation shift with every unpaid salary? Every hungry child at home, every protest chant they recognize as expressing exactly what they themselves are feeling, but cannot say out loud while wearing the uniform. The protests that are now forming across Iran are the context in which this calculation is being forced to a conclusion. And to understand why these protests are different from every previous wave, different from December 2025, different from November 2019, different from June 2009, you need to understand three specific things about them that have no precedent in the history of protest in the Islamic Republic. The first difference is geography. Previous protest waves in Iran followed a predictable pattern that the regime had learned to manage. Intense activity in Tehran and the major urban centers, gradual spread to secondary cities, eventual provincial reach that arrived late enough for the regime to concentrate its resources on the primary locations first, and then address the periphery when the center was stabilized. This is the geographic pattern that the IRGC's suppression doctrine was built around. It is the reason the regime invested so heavily in the rapid deployment capacity of its special units, the ability to concentrate force at the point of maximum pressure before it could spread beyond the threshold of available response capacity. The protests forming in Iran in the summer of 2026 are not following this pattern. They are not starting in Tehran and spreading outward. They are emerging simultaneously in provincial cities, in Ahvaz, in Tabriz, in Rasht, in Bandar Abbas, in Zahedan, in Kermanshah, with an intensity and organizational coherence at the provincial level that has no precedent in the documented history of Iranian protest movements. And they are emerging simultaneously because the conditions producing them are not localized. The conditions are everywhere. The 180% food inflation is everywhere. The water rationing is everywhere. The missed salary payments are everywhere. The unemployment is everywhere. The regime cannot address the conditions in one place without addressing them everywhere because the conditions are the same everywhere. And it cannot suppress the protests in one place by concentrating force there when the protests are forming everywhere simultaneously with comparable intensity. This is the geographic trap that the IRGC's suppression doctrine was never designed for. The doctrine was designed for a concentrated threat that could be met with concentrated response. It has no established playbook for a distributed, simultaneous, multi-city uprising, drawing from conditions that are universal and immediate, and that no available resources can address before the next cycle of protest forms from the same conditions that produced the last one. The second difference is composition. Who is in the streets this time, and what their presence in the streets reveals about the regime's remaining social base. Previous protest waves in Iran drew heavily from specific demographic categories: young people, urban middle-class populations, university students, the professional classes whose economic position had been eroded by sanctions and mismanagement, but who retained enough material stability to make the participation versus risk calculation in favor of participation. These demographics are still present in the current protests, but they have been joined by demographics whose presence changes the nature of what is happening fundamentally. The bazaar merchants are in the streets. This is the single most significant socio-economic signal of any protest wave in Iranian history because the bazaar merchants are not a demographic that protests lightly, that risks their economic position on political principle, or that has historically been associated with challenges to the established order. They are the economic backbone of Iranian commercial life, the constituency that has historically been the regime's most reliable civilian support base outside its formal institutional structure. When bazaar merchants close their shops and join street protests, they are not expressing political ideology. They are expressing economic desperation. They are making the calculation that the risk of continuing to operate in the current economic environment exceeds the risk of political confrontation. And that calculation, coming from that demographic, tells you something about the current economic environment that no macroeconomic statistic can fully convey. The factory workers are in the streets, not in the organized, union-mediated way that labor protest has historically taken in countries with functional labor institutions. In the raw, unmediated way of workers who have not been paid for 2, 3, 4 months, whose employers have told them the money is not available, who have gone home to families they cannot feed on empty promises that the situation will improve, and who have concluded that the streets are the only remaining venue in which their material condition might be addressed by anyone with the power to address it. And most significantly for the IRGC commanders who are watching the protest composition with the specific professional attention of people whose job is to assess threats, the families of IRGC personnel are in the streets, the wives and parents and siblings of the soldiers who have not been paid for 4 months. The households that are experiencing the same 180% food inflation, the same water rationing, the same economic devastation as every other Iranian household, but with the additional specific grievance that the institution responsible for their family members' safety and livelihood has failed to deliver the one concrete material obligation it had toward them, the salary payment. The basic transaction of service for compensation that makes military service a viable life choice rather than an ideological sacrifice. When the families of your security forces are participating in the protests, your security forces are being ordered to suppress, you have crossed a threshold that no authoritarian government has ever successfully navigated without fundamental transformation. Because you are asking your soldiers to choose between the orders of their commanders and the welfare of their mothers, between institutional loyalty and family survival, between the uniform and the household, and that choice, forced on enough men simultaneously, produces the specific behavioral cascade that history records as the moment the security apparatus failed. The third difference is psychological. And this is the dimension of the current protests that most Western analysis has not adequately addressed, because it requires understanding what happened in January 2026, not just as a political event, but as a psychological one, and what the specific psychological aftermath of January 2026 means for the men who participated in it, and who are now being asked to participate in whatever comes next. Between 30,000 and 36,500 Iranian citizens were killed by their own security forces in approximately 48 hours in January 2026. Amnesty International, whose researchers have documented every wave of Iranian repression since the revolution, described the crackdown as unprecedented in the entire history of their work on Iran. Unprecedented. From an organization that has documented 2009 and 2019 and 2022, and every security operation the Islamic Republic has conducted against its own population across 4 decades of periodic brutality. The men who carried out those killings are still in the security apparatus. Some of them are still at their posts, some of them have deserted. Some of them are present in body, but absent in the specific psychological sense of personnel who have experienced what military psychologists call moral injury, the specific damage done to a person's sense of themselves when they are required to act in ways that violate their own ethical framework, so fundamentally that no subsequent justification can fully repair the damage. Moral injury is not guilt in the conventional sense. It is not something that therapy can resolve or that ideology can override once it reaches sufficient depth. It is the specific, persistent, operationally significant condition of a person who knows what they did and cannot reconcile it with who they understood themselves to be. And in the specific context of the Islamic Republic's security apparatus in the summer of 2026, it is producing a behavioral outcome that is directly relevant to the regime's capacity to repeat January's suppression against the current protest wave. The men who killed 30,000 people in 48 hours are being asked to do it again, against a population that is hungrier, angrier, more geographically distributed, more economically desperate, and more diverse in its composition than the population they were ordered to suppress in January. They are being asked to do it again while their own salaries have not been paid for 4 months, while their own families are experiencing the same conditions that are putting people in the streets, while their own colleagues are deserting at 89% rates in documented units, while the parliament of the institution they serve has publicly acknowledged on the official record that the cause for which they were asked to kill 30,000 of their fellow citizens is lost. The psychological weight of that combination, moral injury from January, material grievance from 4 missed payments, institutional disillusionment from the parliamentary admission, social pressure from family members in the protest movements, professional isolation from colleagues who have already deserted, is not something that can be overcome by political commissars giving speeches about revolutionary duty. It is the specific configuration of pressures that military psychologists identify as producing the behavioral shift from compliance to refusal. And it is present, documented, and accumulating in Iran's security apparatus right now. Now let us talk about what refusing orders actually looks like in practice, because this is the detail that is most important for understanding what is currently happening in Iran and most absent from Western news coverage that tends toward the dramatic and visible, rather than the quiet and consequential. Refusing orders in an authoritarian security apparatus does not primarily look like a soldier throwing down his weapon in front of his commander and announcing that he will not comply. That version of refusal exists. It has been documented in Iran. But it is the exception rather than the rule because it requires a level of individual courage and certainty about consequences that most people in most situations do not possess. Most refusal looks like something else entirely. It looks like the unit that was ordered to deploy to a protest location, reporting that 3 of its 4 vehicles are experiencing mechanical problems simultaneously. It looks like the commander who received an order to move at 0600 and somehow misunderstood it as 0800, by which time the operational window had closed. It looks like the checkpoint that was supposed to prevent protest organizers from moving between districts that somehow failed to stop the vehicle carrying the people it was specifically instructed to detain. It looks like the officer whose radio is experiencing interference at the precise moment the order to open fire was transmitted, and who therefore cannot confirm that he received it. It looks like the entire apparatus of institutional life developing a collective, uncoordinated, plausibly deniable creativity in discovering reasons why the specific order that would require them to kill their fellow citizens in the current circumstances cannot, quite, be executed as directed. This is the specific behavioral signature that intelligence analysts are now documenting across multiple Iranian security force units. Not mass refusal, not dramatic defection. Friction. The specific, accumulating, system-degrading friction of an institution whose members are finding ways to not quite do what they are being ordered to do without quite crossing the line that would force their commanders to formally acknowledge that the orders are not being followed. Friction in a military institution is more dangerous than open revolt for a counterintuitive reason. Open revolt can be addressed, it can be identified, isolated, punished, and used as an example to deter further noncompliance. Friction cannot be addressed because it does not present a clear target. You cannot court-martial an entire unit for mechanical failures. You cannot punish a commander for a radio malfunction. You cannot execute a soldier for misunderstanding a transmission time. And while you are trying to manage the friction, while you're trying to maintain the performance of a functional security apparatus against the accumulating evidence that the apparatus is not fully functional, the protests continue, the conditions worsening them continue, and the friction deepens. There is a specific historical precedent for this pattern that is more directly applicable to Iran's current situation than the Soviet comparison or the Romanian comparison that most analysts reach for. It is the final months of the Shah's regime in 1978 and early 1979. The Shah's security forces did not simply switch sides in a single dramatic moment. They went through exactly the friction phase that Iran's security forces are currently experiencing. Operational failures that were difficult to attribute to individual decision-making. Deployment delays that seemed logistically explicable. Engagement rules that were followed in their technical form, but not in their operational intent. And then, when the accumulation of friction reached sufficient density, the moment where enough individuals made the same calculation simultaneously that the performance of compliance was no longer worth maintaining, and the institution that had appeared solid from the outside revealed itself to be hollow at precisely the moment the regime needed it most. The Shah had an army of 400,000. He had SAVAK. He had U.S.-supplied equipment and training, and an institutional structure that had operated effectively for decades. It was not enough, because the men inside it had stopped believing that the institution's survival was worth the cost of maintaining their own compliance with it. And when men stopped believing that, institutions stopped functioning, regardless of their size, their equipment, their formal command structure, or the official order of battle that describes them as operational. The IRGC in the summer of 2026 has 89% absence rates at documented bases. It has 4 consecutive missed salary payment cycles. It has Air Force pilots declining combat missions. It has soldiers refusing to transport wounded Allied personnel. It has commanders whose units are discovering operational complications that delay deployment to protest locations. It has the families of its personnel in the streets that its remaining personnel are being ordered to suppress. And it has the specific, accumulated, institutionally devastating psychological weight of having participated in the killing of 30,000 citizens in January, while the parliament of the institution it serves has publicly acknowledged that the cause for which those citizens were killed was already lost when they were killed. This is not an institution on the verge of losing its capacity to suppress protest. This is an institution that has already lost coherent institutional will and is currently losing operational capacity at a rate that no available intervention can reverse, because the intervention that could reverse it, reliable salary payment, requires money that the bankrupt treasury does not have. Now let us address the question that every serious analyst of Iranian politics is currently debating with an urgency that diplomatic language cannot capture. What happens when the IRGC's refusal to follow orders reaches the threshold that makes the next protest wave unsuppressible? What happens when the friction accumulates to the point where the performance of compliance can no longer be maintained? What happens to a regime whose security apparatus has stopped being a security apparatus? The answer has three possible forms, and which form it takes will determine not just the future of Iran, but the future of the entire Middle East, the global energy architecture, and the nuclear security framework that the entire international community has been managing for 2 decades. The first possibility is managed transition, a scenario in which a senior IRGC commander, someone with sufficient institutional authority to be credible, sufficient political awareness to understand what the mathematics are producing, and sufficient personal courage to move before the institution collapses around him, makes the calculation that managing the transition is better than being buried by it, that negotiating the terms of a new political arrangement, however painful for the IRGC's institutional position, is preferable to presiding over a state collapse that would end the IRGC as an institution and potentially end the individuals who led it in ways more final than institutional transformation. This scenario requires one person to move first, and it requires that person to have the standing with both the remaining IRGC command structure and with the international community to make the move legible as genuine rather than theatrical. The conditions for this scenario are present in a way they were not 6 months ago. The parliamentary admission has provided institutional cover. A commander who moves toward transition can point to the Parliament's own recorded acknowledgement that continuation is impossible. The financial collapse has provided material incentive. The IRGC's economic empire, the construction conglomerates and telecommunications networks and petrochemical interests, are losing value at a rate that makes a negotiated arrangement that preserves some institutional economic position preferable to a collapse that destroys it entirely. And the international community has provided a framework. The diplomatic channels that President Pezeshkian has been attempting to activate and the IRGC command has been blocking are still available. They require only a decision to use them. The second possibility is unmanaged collapse. The scenario in which no actor retains sufficient authority to direct what happens when the protests exceed the security apparatus's capacity to suppress them and the state's ability to function begins failing simultaneously across multiple systems. This is the scenario that terrifies every regional intelligence service, every neighboring government, every international institution with responsibility for nuclear security. An unmanaged collapse in Iran is not a political transition. It is a humanitarian catastrophe involving 85 million people, a power vacuum in one of the world's most strategically sensitive geographies, an unsecured nuclear program, and the dissolution of the institutional structures, however corrupt and brutal, that have maintained a kind of order across the Iranian plateau for 46 years. No regional power wants this scenario, not Saudi Arabia, not Turkey, not Israel, not the United States, but wanting and preventing are different things. And the ability to prevent this scenario diminishes with each week that the financial collapse deepens, the security apparatus fractures further, and the protests grow larger without any political process capable of addressing their material causes. The third possibility is the one that every nuclear security analyst is losing sleep over. A desperate final escalation by IRGC commanders who have concluded that the costs of all available options are equivalent and that the institutional satisfaction of a final defiant act is preferable to the humiliation of managed capitulation. This scenario does not require rationality, it requires desperation. And desperation is what an institution looks like when it has missed 4 consecutive salary payments, watched 89% of its personnel abandon their posts, presided over a parliamentary admission of defeat, and is now watching the protest wave that its depleted forces cannot suppress beginning to form in 6 provincial capitals simultaneously. The nuclear dimension of this scenario is not theoretical. The IRGC has institutional control of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Its incentive to reach weapons threshold before financial collapse forces a decision has increased, not decreased, as its conventional military capacity has degraded. A financially bankrupt, institutionally fractured, externally blockaded paramilitary organization with nuclear ambitions, operating without functional civilian oversight, with a supreme leader who cannot be reached and an elected president who cannot govern. This is not a scenario that any theoretical framework for nuclear security was designed to manage. It is the scenario that every think tank in Washington and every intelligence agency in Europe has been gaming out in theoretical terms for 20 years. It is no longer theoretical. The protests are different this time, not just because of their geography or their composition or their intensity, because of what they are forcing on the other side of the line. Because of the specific, historically documented, irreversible calculation they are triggering in the men who have been carrying the weapons and following the orders, and maintaining the performance of institutional loyalty that the Islamic Republic's survival has depended on. Those men are doing the mathematics. They are doing it individually, quietly, privately, in barracks where 89% of their colleagues are already gone, in homes where their families are experiencing the same hunger and thirst and economic desperation as the people they are being ordered to suppress. In the specific psychological space between an order being given and an order being followed, where every authoritarian regime's survival is ultimately determined. And the mathematics they are doing is producing the same answer that the same mathematics produced in Tehran in 1979, that produced the same answer in Moscow in 1991, that produced the same answer in Bucharest in 1989, that has produced the same answer in every authoritarian collapse of the modern era, when the financial flows that purchased institutional loyalty stopped flowing, and the moral weight of the orders being given exceeded the institutional and material incentives for compliance. The answer is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a press release or a public statement or a visible, photographable moment of historical clarity. It arrives in the friction, in the mechanical failures, in the misunderstood transmission times, in the 89% absence rates, in the soldier who shows up but finds that his feet will not move in the direction of the crowd, in the commander who receives the order and discovers an operational complication that cannot quite be resolved before the window closes. It arrives quietly, the way every real turning point in history arrives, before everyone recognizes it as a turning point. And in Iran, right now, it is arriving. The protesters are in the streets. The soldiers are at the door. And between the order and its execution, in the specific space where history is actually made, not in parliaments, not in command centers, not in diplomatic communiques, but in the individual calculations of individual men who have been given individual orders and who are individually deciding what those orders are worth. Something is happening that the Islamic Republic has spent 46 years and all of its oil revenue trying to prevent. The men with the weapons are choosing, and they are not choosing the regime. If what you just watched gave you something that you cannot find in the mainstream coverage of Iran, not the headline version, not the press conference version, but the real version that the 89% absence rates and the missed salary payments and the families in the streets and the soldiers at the door are all telling, then do something with that. Share this video with one person who is trying to understand what is actually happening. Not because it will change what is coming. What is coming does not need our permission. But because 85 million people are living inside this calculation, and the rest of the world deserves to understand what they are living through. Drop your answer in the comments to the question that matters most right now. When IRGC soldiers refuse orders to suppress protesters, who include their own family members, when the men with the weapons are choosing, what is the one thing the regime still has left? What is the last card? What does it play and when does it play it? The comments on this channel have been ahead of the mainstream analysis on every major Iran development for months. Be ahead of it again. Tell us what you see coming. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next development makes everything said today make even more sense. Because it is coming. The mathematics that 85 million people and 31 soldiers at a base designed for 340 are all running simultaneously do not produce uncertainty about whether something changes. They produce certainty about when, and you will want to have been watching when it does.